In a monologue this weekend, CNN's Brian Stelter took aim at Fox News, advocating for strategies to limit that cable news network, the rival network, of course, to CNN's reach. Let's take a listen.
Dishonest cries of censorship are filling Fox's airwaves with charges that these guys right here are being suppressed. The word censorship's been invoked almost 400 times on Fox this month alone, and more than 300 times on Newsmax. You know, post-insurrection, a book publisher decided that it did not want to be in business with Senator Josh Hawley. So he's been on a national TV tour claiming he's muzzled. And Tucker Carlson is telling viewers that this network, CNN, is trying to force Fox News off the air, which is patently false. But reducing a liar's reach is not the same as censoring freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is different than freedom of reach. And algorithmic reach is part of the problem.
So here to discuss is journalist Zaid Jilani. Zaid, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Sagar.
So, Zaid, let's start with this, which is the central premise of Stelter's monologue was that, you know, the cable carrier companies removing Fox News from their carrying capacity would not be the same thing as silencing Fox News. Now, that's obviously ridiculous, but he's couching it in the language of freedom of speech and therefore of case law. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because this slogan that he used in particular, that freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, is the kind of thing that you'd find in kind of fringe corners of the internet, people arguing against like basic norms, but somehow it found its way onto CNN. And it does actually go against much of what we thought about freedom of speech in the U.S. traditionally, because if you look at court cases, for instance, whether it's things like free speech, quote unquote, free speech zones at universities that have been rolled back, or deciding where someone can protest, or talking about a public employee's right to speech, it always comes down to a court deciding whether or not something is a reasonable kind of accommodation for speech. So that means that if you're reducing someone's reach, it actually can be a violation of their freedom of speech. I mean, it's not that it's only a violation of freedom of speech if the government comes to your house and arrests you for saying something in like your closet or, in your den or something, right? It's also about allowing a reasonable ability to express yourself. I mean, even in the case of when Trump was on Twitter, when he blocked people, he was taken to court over that, and they found that to be a violation of free speech, right? Just to be able to read what a government official was saying. So I think that, Stelter has constructed a very narrow definition, primarily for the purpose of censoring his political opponents, right? I mean, we just had a military coup in Myanmar over the weekend. And one of the first things they did was strip CNN and BBC from the airwaves. People can no longer watch those TV networks. Now, under Stelter's definition, that's not a blow to freedom of speech, right? CNN and BBC still exist. Someone can still find them. Maybe you can use a VPN to go to their website or something, but they've been taken off the airwaves, right? That's, they could easily repeat the same maxim that Stelter did and just say, we're just reducing their reach. They're still speaking. They're not in jail or anything, but obviously it's, here's a very easy definition of censorship. It's not deciding what you can watch. I mean, Stelter can watch whatever he wants, although I think we'll get to this in a second. I don't think he watches very much Fox News if he's blaming them for election conspiracies. But censorship is deciding what other people can watch and what other people can say, right? And that's why what he's talking about.
That is one of the interesting points here. And actually, Glenn Greenwald had gotten a little bit of a back and forth with Brian Stelter about this topic, which is worth taking a look at. But, if the same sort of concerns, even if you accepted Stelter's argument, which I don't, but even if you did, the same concerns and charges he's leveling against Fox News could easily be applied to CNN as well. So do they really like the road that Stelter is ultimately putting them on here?
I mean, that's exactly the case, because you have to understand there are already some tools available to people if, for instance, there are falsehoods told about a non-public individual that are related to some kind of injury they suffered. A good case of that would be the Covington Catholic story, right? Where CNN and other networks blew up a teenager who was just a nobody, kind of misleadingly told the story of an argument he had on a Capitol Mall. And CNN ended up paying a sum of money to him because they were sued related to libel. And I think, and slander. And so these, there are some tools available to people to deal with networks like repeatedly lying, causing some monetary damage or some form of injury. And those tools have been used, and I think those are appropriate curbs on speech, but they're very narrow also, right? You can't just sue anyone for anything related to libel, and journalists usually do have a long leash when it comes to that. But I do think that Stelter needs to think hard about what he's saying. I mean, we have seen, for instance, in recent days that Andrew Cuomo maybe did not do such a great job managing the pandemic in his state. Maybe he didn't protect people in nursing homes, for instance. CNN spent the last year having his own family interview him, giving him softball interviews, talking about how great of a job he's doing, right? You could very well argue that CNN was misleading a lot of people about how a top public official was managing the single deadliest thing that was happening in the United States, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. Would Stelter want Fox News to go on a rant about how CNN should be ripped from American homes and people shouldn't be allowed to watch it because they misled people about Cuomo's performance during the pandemic? I mean, I don't think he would want that. And it's wild. I don't think if you roll back the clock 5 or 10 years, you would see people making these types of arguments. You would see them criticize news networks when they make mistakes, criticize them for sloppy reporting. But you wouldn't be talking about removing them altogether. That shows very little faith in liberal democracy. You can't have a network that's constantly preening about how much they care about democracy, and then at the same time talking about removing their competitors from the airways, not letting people even watch them or associate with them or speak about them. That is, talking. That's more in the autocratic territory, right? That's more in the vein of something like China than the United States. And I think that we need to be critical of media when it messes up. I think lots of stuff on cable news, unfortunately, is sensationalized. It's half truths. It's misleading, and sometimes it's conspiratorial. And that goes for CNN as well. I think much of the way CNN covered policing last year was overly sensational, and you could argue contributed to a climate where there were riots and deaths and unfortunately a lot of violence. But my response to that would be to criticize CNN, to urge them to do better, to offer alternatives to CNN. I think shows like this are an alternative to cable news. It isn't to say that people just shouldn't be allowed to watch it. I mean, at that point, I'm stepping out of the boundaries of liberal democratic discourse, right? I'm telling other people I should dictate to them what they can believe, rather than having any kind of conversation with them. And I think that's the fatal error of really what he's arguing. And the last point I want to say here is that I think if you actually watch Fox News over the past few months, which I'm not sure Stelter even seems to do, even though he runs a media criticism show, they've lost a number of viewers to other more right-wing networks because they, for the most part, rejected election conspiracies. Tucker Carlson shut down the main one from Sidney Powell, who was working for President Trump, and he refused to continue to cover their claims. So I think Fox News actually has been pushing back on a lot of these conspiracies lately, and I think they do deserve some applause for that, even though I share some criticisms of the network and how they cover issues more generally. And I think that's really what we need to encourage. We don't need to start creating a fortress mentality where we start, when a network is actually pushing back on all this stuff we don't like, that isn't the point where we start saying that network should be taken off the air, right? That sends a signal to Fox News that no matter what they do, liberals will just try to shut them down, so they may as well just lie and mislead, which is not the message we want to send at all. So
I think that's exactly right. Zaid, thanks so much for joining us, man. Really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Zaid. Well, more rising for you after this.